Good morning, and thanks to everyone who survived the ordeal yesterday and decided to turn up this morning. And I want to begin by thanking the organizers of the conference. You did a really bang-up job of putting us up and organizing all the panels so well and putting us up in this lovely, lovely building. So today I'm going to be talking mostly about Abdul, an Egyptian Azhari trained theologian. If you haven't heard his name before, well, you are about to get an earful about him because he actually inaugurated a very interesting concept of Islamic governance, which didn't get a lot of traction before, but I think he's getting renewed attention in the contemporary period, and rightly so. So the title of my paper is Revisiting the Theology of Islamic Governance, Abdul and His Critics. So there are a number of people who attempt to read into the Quran a distinctive mandate for the creation of a particular political culture and even a specific form of government. Most notable among them are certain Islamists in the modern period who claim to derive a wholesale political system based on scripture and who regard its establishment as the most urgent priority for Muslims in the contemporary period. They tend to project this view back to the formative period of Islam and reject the idea that government in an Islamic milieu might be purely concerned with worldly and pragmatic notions of statecraft and have nothing to do with an assumed divine mandate. Religion and state are assumed to be fused together, and the two conjoined spheres are therefore governed by immutable scriptural directives. Like most truisms, this particular one concerning the religious provenance of governance within Islam is problematic. Our earliest document is the Quran itself, which contains no reference to the issue of the caliphate, nor does it contain explicitly political terms. This, however, has not prevented some Muslims from reading political meanings back into specific Quranic terms such as Amr, Khalifa, and Hukm, so that their apolitical significations in the Quran became transformed into primarily political ones by the 3rd century of Islam or the 9th century of the Common Era. The desirability of good governance and the necessity of establishing some form of government or another is both an old and new issue within Islamic thought. In the contemporary period, there is a spectrum of perspectives on what constitutes legitimate governance and what institutions are required to implement it in Muslim-majority societies. The rise of Islamist parties to political prominence in the aftermath of the Arab Spring in Tunisia and Egypt, followed by a return to authoritarian forms of government, have made questions concerning what constitutes just and legitimate forms of Islamic governance rise to the foreground again in the contemporary period. Against this backdrop, we would do well to remember the heated debates concerning the nature of Islamic governance in the first half of the 20th century, after the abolition of the Ottoman Caliphate in 1924. We now therefore turn to one key thinker and his provocative book in the first quarter of the 20th century that reopened this particular can of worms, which actually never went away, the dust from which, if I may deliberately mix metaphors, has still not fully settled in our own time. So in the aftermath of the dissolution of the Ottoman Caliphate in 1924 by the Republican Turks, an Azhar-trained Egyptian religious scholar, Ali Abdul, who died in 1966, wrote a work which questioned the religious foundations of the office of the caliph. The work was titled Al-Islam wa Usul al-Hukm, Islam and the Principles of Governance, published in 1925, and it exploded like a bombshell in the Islamic world, adding, as must have appeared to many, insult to injury. The book essentially argued that the caliphate was not a religiously mandated institution, and that Muslims are under no obligation to establish or re-establish the office. Published against the backdrop of widespread dismay resulting from the peremptory end to the Ottoman Caliphate, Abdul Razak's work created a firestorm of controversy. Some of his detractors regarded it as an attack upon Islam itself, though the author's attempts to devalue, through the author's attempts to devalue a long-standing institution within historical Islam. While Abdul Razak's views have received some scholarly mention in the context of Islamic modernism, the counter-arguments of his critics have not received similar attention. A detailed understanding of both Abdul Razak's and his critics' perspectives is, however, essential for reconstructing an important religious intellectual debate about leadership and Muslim communal identity in the early 20th century. These early modern debates about the religious necessity for institutionalizing political authority continue to exert considerable influence on contemporary Muslim discourses about the parameters of legitimate governance and the construction of political authority. So my discussion will now go on to focus on some of the salient features of Abdul Razak's treatise and then proceed to present in brief, because of time restrictions. I'm assuming we can have a little longer time since only the two of us, okay. And then proceed to present in brief the refutations of two of his most trenchant critics, the Egyptian scholar Muhammad Bakhit al-Muti'i, who died in 1935, who was the Grand Mufti of Egypt at the time, and the Tunisian scholar Muhammad al-Khidr Hussein, who died in 1958, and who became the Sheikh al-Azhar in 1952, all very prominent religious figures at the time. An analysis, necessarily brief here, of the doctrinal and legal arguments crafted by these authors to argue their respective positions concerning the caliphate will allow us to dwell on the larger ramifications of this critical debate on the subject of organizing and governing Muslim majority societies until today. Abdul Razak and his critics all claim to be basing their respective arguments firmly on the foundational texts of Islam. That's their point of departure, or at least their claimed point of departure, namely the Quran and Hadith, and particularly in the case of his critics, on the classical Islamic theological and legal tradition. While their sources overlap, their approach to the relevant text and their interpretive strategies are often quite different. An analysis of these different reading strategies is highly revealing of the process of constructing competing visions of the past, especially as they relate to conceptions of prophethood and political governance. So Abdul Razak's treatise is fundamentally concerned with the deconstruction of the classical views on the imamate that had emerged roughly after the 10th century. The key question for him is whether the establishment of the Medinan polity is to be regarded as an integral part of Muhammad's prophetic mission or as an extraneous, contingent development that occurred in response to specific historical developments at that time. Abdul Razak mounts his critique of the standard juridical and theological position that Muhammad was both prophet and head of state, or king, actually, as he phrases it, a term that gave offense to a lot of his critics, and that the latter position evolved out of the former by assessing whether this position can be squared primarily with the Quran and to a lesser extent with the Hadith literature. If these dual roles, that is, as prophet and king, are scripturally mandated, where are the evidentiary texts, he asks. Instead, he argues, the Quran emphasizes Muhammad's role as a warner, nadhir or mudhakkir or reminder, and a messenger, rasul, and categorically rejects any role for the prophet as a guardian over the people, hafid or wakil, or a powerful ruler, jabbar, who seeks to impose his sovereignty, musaitir, over the people. A king or head of state, in the usual sense, must possess all these attributes, he says. The Quran's rejection of them in relation to Muhammad unambiguously establishes the apolitical nature of his apostleship. This unambiguous nature is further established through the content of relevant hadiths, in which the prophet denies the ascription of kingship and political power to himself. And here Abdul Razak cites the well-known hadith in which the prophet states, "I'm neither a king nor a tyrant, lastu bi malik wala jabbar," explicitly rejecting the role of a prophet king for himself. Aspects of Muhammad's roles in Medina that do appear overtly political are, according to Abdul Razik, either accidental and completely divorced from his apostleship, or are tied exclusively to his prophetic mission and not meant to be replicated by ordinary Muslims after him. These included his activities of revenue collection, the appointment of governors and judges, and the carrying out of the military jihad. If any of these activities were religiously mandated as opposed to being pragmatic responses to specific time-bound circumstances, Abdul Razik argues, the Prophet would have left detailed instructions concerning their implementation, in addition to having endorsed a specific political system. In the absence of such directives, one must logically assume that none of these political and worldly matters have theological implications and are not religiously binding on Muslims. To assert this, consequently, is not an act of heresy, which is what Abdul Razik was actually accused of in the aftermath of the publication of his book. Classical jurists, nevertheless, went on to articulate the contrary position, that specific political institutions, particularly the caliphate, and certain political processes were religiously binding upon Muslims in order to unite them politically. Abdul Razik's rejoinder to such arguments is that the juridical objective of achieving political unity, wahda siyasiyya, is actually contrary to God's will, since it is clearly articulated in the Quran that he had purposefully refrained from creating a single human community. For example, in Quran 548. The juridical consensus on such political matters is therefore merely the result of rational and pragmatic responses to specific events during the pre-modern period, which threatened to, and indeed did, fracture the Muslim community. Recognition of the historically restricted nature of such a consensus leaves the door wide open for a new consensus to emerge among Muslims through similar rational processes of deliberation regarding modes of governance that are appropriate to the changed circumstances in the modern period. Islam desires ease for its followers, he says. Replication of antiquated social and political processes would constitute hardship for contemporary Muslims, and the imposition of such a hardship would therefore violate the spirit of the Quran. In Abdul Razik's hermeneutics, the point of departure is without doubt the Quranic text above all, which should be understood on its own terms. The resulting understanding of the scriptural text, unmediated by later human exegeses, should serve as a corrective to the ultimately human, fallible, and contingent interpretations of the jurists and theologians through time. The counter-arguments of al-Muti'i and Hussein show, not surprisingly, a great deal of convergence. Both are essentially in agreement that it is the classical theological and juridical tradition that emerged after the 3rd century of Islam, which establishes the correct and comprehensive paradigm for instituting political processes and institutions. It is from this vantage point that they then proceed to interpret what they understand to be relevant proof texts culled from the Quran and Hadith. Thus, al-Muti'a invokes Quran 4:105, chapter 4, verse 105, which states, "Indeed, we have revealed to you the book in truth, so that you may judge among the people according to what God has shown you." He interprets this verse as creating a scriptural mandate for conjoining political office to prophethood and to establish the imperative for continuing such a political office after the demise of the prophet. As is to be expected in such a context, the Arabic verbal collocation لِتَحْكُمَ بَيْنَ النَّاسِ, which occurs in the verse, is understood by al-Muti'i to unambiguously refer to rule in the political sense, rather than to judge in the broadest and most basic sense. This politicized understanding is connected to Muti'i's conviction that the obligation to summon to Islam, da'wah, must be fulfilled by a state and its military apparatus, for Muslims must spread their rule over others and resist being subjugated by non-Muslims, he says. This interpretation, favored by a number of the classical jurists, is imposed by Muti'i on the Quran itself. Such an enterprise then, according to him, requires an organized political entity that is to be entrusted with such a duty, the obligatory nature of which is inferred through this circuitous reasoning rather than through any explicit scriptural mandate. Hussein similarly tends to work backwards from juridical pronouncements to the Quran and Sunnah, all of which for him also represents a seamless whole. Thus, the conjoining of prophethood with political power is understood to have been categorically established mainly on the basis of the scholarly consensus, which affirmed that Muhammad was a messenger, a prophet, and a political ruler and legislator. Such a position is subsequently understood to be consonant with the Quranic and Sunnaic understanding of Muhammad's roles. Hussein basically agrees with Abdul that this position is inferred from the Quran and the Sunnah rather than explicitly mentioned. So there is a little bit of a common ground between at least the two of them. I think Hussein, often concedes more than al-Muti'i that a lot of what Abdul is saying is actually commonsensical and acceptable. However, according to them, whereas Abdul then went on to say that such a historically deductive process frees contemporary Muslims to engage in renewed interpretation of relevant texts, the former states the exact opposite. That is, Hussein states the exact opposite. That since scholarly consensus had invested this historical process and its resulting conclusions with normativity, Muslims are not at liberty to overturn this consensus by similarly studying and understanding foundational texts in light of their own circumstances. Neither Hussein nor Muti'i deal at length with the verses foregrounded by Abdul in which the Prophet is described primarily as a warner and a reminder, or with the hadith in which Muhammad himself rejects any function as a prophet king. Hussein cites instead Quran 459, which asks believers to obey God and his prophet and those possessing authority among them, a very well-known verse that's often cited in many political contexts, but also theological contexts, as emphasizing political obedience to Muhammad and his successors, even though the nature of that authority is not specified in the verse. Later exegetes and jurists, however, did impose primarily a political understanding on this verse, and it is to this exegetical development that Hussein is indebted for making his case against Abdul The politicized understanding of the Quran and Sunnah eventually became the predominant one among religious scholars and jurists, creating a scholarly consensus, ijma', which came to be regarded as inerrant and which also became firmly established as a critical juridical principle. Ultimately, for both Hussein and al-Muti'i, it is this consensus of scholars and jurists through the centuries on political matters which trumps the rereading of the Quran and Hadith in isolation from the classical juridical and exegetical tradition, as Abdul attempts to do. As a consequence, they are both resorting to back interpretation, an exercise in retrospective exegesis, which allows one to deduce scriptural justification for legal rulings considered a priori appropriate. For Abdul and other modernists like him, ascribing normativity to a purely historical process represents a dangerous conflation of contingent and ultimately imperfect human understanding of the divine will with the divine will itself. Abdul relative obscurity and continued unpopularity in conservative circles today reminds us that throughout history, in complex religious intellectual traditions, this conflation has remained a fraught and highly contested issue, especially within the crucible of religion and politics. And some of these issues had already begun to surface yesterday. I remember when we talked about religion and politics in other contexts. So I'm going to now turn to a brief discussion of the implications of this debate for 21st century conversations on religion and politics. And as I said, this debate actually still continues to cast a fairly long shadow on contemporary discourses. Abdul Razak's position in favor of a separation between religion and politics resonates strongly among liberal and modernist Muslims as an accurate reflection of the traditional separation between religious and political authority already characteristic of Islam's formative period. Traditionally, the ulama constituted a class unto themselves, and the rulers were actually responsible for implementing their legislative decisions and stayed out of the whole legislative process. Now, this separation between religious and political authority is misleadingly characterized as secular, with the implication of being irreligious by his detractors. And Stefan and I were having a conversation breakfast today, how secular immediately has that connotation in a number of circles, right? Here, I mean, if you simply characterize as separation between religions and political authority, well, that was actually already characteristic of early society. And his detractors, however, jump on this distinction and try to paint him as someone who's secular and therefore irreligious. The work Al-Islam wa Usul al-Hukm reveals his author, however, as drawing firmly upon the Quran, relevant hadith, and early history to make a plausible case for his perspective, not exactly the approach of secularists or many secularists. Al-Muti'ai's and Hussein's rebuttals are very close, if not identical in parts, to contemporary conservative Islamist arguments for establishing the Islamic State as a prelude to the revitalization of the Ummah, which do not draw upon the Quran to affirm its necessity, because it cannot, but rather primarily upon the juridical consensus that emerged on this point well after the first 3 centuries of Islam. Neither of them satisfactorily respond to Abdul Razak's question that ultimately has to do with hermeneutics. If pre-modern Muslims could go through a deductive inferential process by rationally engaging foundational texts and fashioning positions concerning political administration appropriate to their contexts, what restricts the ability and the right of Muslims today to similarly re-engage these sources and extrapolate answers from them that are more in tune with their own circumstances? It is clear that modernists consider the hermeneutical process itself to be replicable in the modern period, but not necessarily the conclusions from the pre-modern period, since they were historically contingent. Whereas conservative or traditionalists and now hardline Islamists conversely regard the conclusions themselves as normatively binding, and the hermeneutical process to have effectively ended in the pre-modern period. Abdul Razak's discussion, although that can be debated, of course there has also been many attempts on the part of many Islamists to reinterpret some of these positions as well. Abdul Razak's discussion also brings to the fore the process of politicization of certain Quranic terms by post-classical Muslim authors, which in the original context do not have overt political connotations. Both his detractors freely draw upon these post-classical sources to make their case. Thus, the term hukum is understood by Muti'ai and Hussein to refer to political rule rather than the more obvious meaning of judgment, specifically divine judgment of humans in the next world. This politicized meaning has been fully embraced in the writings of the prominent Islamist ideologue of the 20th century, Abu Ala Maududi, as well as by Sayyid Qutb and others who follow in their wake. Proceeding from this politicization of the meaning of the Quranic hukum, Maududi in his works coined the term al-hakimiyya, or divine sovereignty, which, as conceptualized by him, is opposed to the notion of democracy, or even just forms of representative government, since that would be predicated on popular sovereignty. Maududi, in fact, presents al-hakimiyya as a concept that has always informed Muslim political culture and thought, a position that is impossible to maintain when one surveys the early history of the Muslim polity. It is, in fact, a term and concept that was coined in the 20th century and represents a rupture from mainstream Sunni political thought. The Quran, to be sure, emphasizes God's suzerainty and refers to God's dominion over all the heavens and the earth, for example, in Quran 24:42. The word used in this context is mulk, while elsewhere it is malakut, for example, in 36:83. Hukum is not used at all in the sense of divine dominion or sovereignty in the Quran, but to refer to divine judgment of human actions, particularly in the next world. The term hukum otherwise does not have an early political genealogy. And this is confirmed by the fact that early commentators on the Quran, like Muqatil ibn Sulaiman from the 8th century, understand hukum and its derivatives to refer primarily to God's moral judgment, in Arabic, qada, of humans, in this world and the next. When the term is used in relation to humans, it also refers to legal adjudication and conveys no intrinsic, this-worldly political signification. In fact, I did a diachronic survey of the term hukum as occurs in the Quran in the tafsir works, and you don't encounter the meaning of political rule at all in these classical commentaries. Although Abdul Razak did not use the term al-hakimiyya in his Al-Islam wa Usul al-Hukm, his rejection of the assumed religious foundations of the caliphate can be understood to represent a critique of the premises of the theory of divine sovereignty. In his conceptualization of the political realm, rational human beings, guided by scripture, carve out their own political destiny based on the principles of maslaha, as we know, a very popular word which refers to the common good, and in recognition of pragmatic realities. Once scorned for what was deemed to be heterodox views, Abdul Razak's views today seem much more congenial and in line with contemporary pro-democratic Muslim sensibilities. So I'm going to just leave it there and look forward to your comments and questions.